Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, brothers and sisters. Welcome to another episode of Sapient Thoughts, where we discuss theophilosophical issues, where we reply to and answer contentions about Islam, and where we provide and put forth a robust, clear, unequivocal case for the veracity of Islam. Now, in today's episode, which is part of a multi-part series that we're doing on the topic of worldview and fitrah, today we're going to continue where we left off from the last episode. Now, as you may recall, if you saw the last few episodes in the series, that we had spoke about worldviews. We had spoke about what a worldview is, the fact that everybody has a worldview, the fact that a worldview is what determines a person's opinions about things. It determines a person's how they view certain questions and the answers to certain questions and so on. And we also discussed the components of one's worldview. Now, if you remember, the components of one's worldview, there was a type of hierarchy. And we discussed that this hierarchy has within it an ontology, which is what is and what is not. Based on the answer of does God exist, we said there's a theology. We said that right after that there's an epistemology, knowledge, the sources of knowledge. We said right after that you have the concept or the idea of an anthropology. Again, what or who is man, not the field that you find on colleges and universities. Then you have the idea or the component or worldview which we called teleology. In other words, purpose, like what is the purpose of man, what is the purpose of the universe. From there, we said you have morality and ethics, which then after that you have law and politics, and then we said at the bottom of this hierarchy you have aesthetics. So we spoke in some detail about this. And what we wanted to do in today's episode was actually compare the Islamic worldview to the modern worldview, in the sense that we'll take some of the components of the Islamic worldview and compare it to some of the components of the modern worldview. So what we're going to do, we'll take the Islamic worldview, and you can do this with any worldview. So you have the Islamic worldview and the modern worldview, or the Islamic worldview and the Christian worldview, or the Islamic worldview and the postmodern worldview, and so on and so forth. So, for purposes of today, however, in today's episode, we're going to be looking at the Islamic worldview compared to the modern worldview. And we're going to be looking at a few of the components, not all of them, but specifically we'll be looking at ontology. So let's start with that. When we investigate and we look into the Islamic worldview and we start with ontology as one of the components and on this hierarchy being the highest component perhaps, that from that perspective we start with the question of is there a God? And of course within the Islamic worldview under Islamic ontology, we can see very clearly that indeed the answer to that question is yes. There is a God. In fact, that God is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Under the modern worldview, there's a big question mark. Who knows? Maybe there is, maybe there's not. When we look at the Islamic worldview, again, we're in the category of ontology. In the Islamic worldview, when we look at the supernatural, that is there such a thing that's beyond the natural world? And in the Islamic worldview, that also there's a category, or rather we say that is a categorical yes. You have the unseen world, and that unseen world composes of things like angels and jinn, and it also includes things like the ruh or the soul of the human being. That's part of the unseen, which in Arabic is called alamul ghaib, the unseen realm. Now coming over to the modern worldview, again the supernatural world is denied. So under the Islamic worldview, supernatural world, there it exists. Under the modern worldview, it's denied. Moving on, the seen realm, what's known in Arabic as alam al-shahada. Yes, in the Islamic worldview, there is a seen world. It is the alam al-shahada. And also within the modern worldview, there is the empirical or natural world, right? And so that is also accepted. So in this case, both the Islamic worldview and the modern worldview hold that yes, there is the empirical world, the seen world, if in terms of alam al-shahada. What about now an identifiable eschaton? Here what we mean by eschaton is eschaton coming from the term eschatology, or related to the term eschatology, what happens at the end or what happens related to death or after death. So under the modern worldview, there's no identifiable eschaton. There's no sort of answer to what happens after you die. It's just you die, and so therefore there's no identifiable eschaton. It's denied. Under the Islamic worldview, you find here that there's a very clear eschaton, and that is that there's a resurrection, there's a judgment, there's moral accounting, there's a heaven and a hell, and all of these concepts which come under an identifiable eschaton, which under the modern worldview is denied. What about an objective meaning to life, or a teleology? Under the modern worldview, that's denied. Does that exist? No, it doesn't. Under the Islamic worldview, there's a cosmos, there's human life infused with purpose and meaning. So under the Islamic worldview, there is a purpose, there exists a purpose, and that purpose on the Islamic worldview is to recognize and worship the divine. So what we can see from an ontological point of view, or when we're looking at the ontology component of the two worldviews, we see that Islam is infused with content and is rich and it is heavy with content. Whereas when you look at the modern worldview, it is quite light, and maybe we could say it's almost emaciated, where there's not really much there in terms of ontology. Now, moving on to the second component of a worldview, and that is epistemology. When we look at the Islamic worldview, under its epistemology, it has a very clear source of knowledge, that being revelation, what we call wahi or tanzil, that being the Quran and the Sunnah. Now, is there an equivalent in the modern worldview? There is not. When we move on, what about sense experience? In Arabic, this is known as hiss. This is part of the Islamic worldview in terms of its epistemology, and it's a part of the modern worldview as well. So both of these have sense experience, hiss, that sensory experience, what you know by your senses, by your smell, your taste, your sight, your auditory senses, etc. What about reason? The idea of aql. Well, in the Islamic worldview, there is a very robust and clear, and there's a lot of weight that's applied to the idea of reason. Similarly, in the modern worldview, there is reason and there's weight that's given to it, quite a bit of weight in both camps, and both these epistemological camps. Under the Islamic worldview, there's also a heavy emphasis that's placed on what's known as testimony, or testimonial knowledge, or knowledge by way of report, what in Arabic is known as khabar, or khabar sadiq. This is something that there's a lot of emphasis on it, and it's and this is a way to gain knowledge, and it's very clear, and it's a very robust system when we think about the Quran, when we think about hadith methodology, and so on and so forth. When we come over to the modern worldview, yes, there is the idea of testimony and testimonial knowledge. People have spoken about it, and one could argue that without testimonial knowledge, you wouldn't really have much knowledge to go on. Elizabeth Fricker, as I mentioned, had spoken about this topic in some detail, and she talks about how the knowledge from the say-so of others helps us to expand our epistemic limitations. And so if we didn't have testimony, we'd run into some issues. While that may be true, it's not conceptually central within the modern worldview. So you have it almost by necessity, but it's not conceptually central, whereas under the Islamic framework, it is conceptually central. Now, what about under the Islamic worldview, the idea of, you can say, first principles or axiomatic truths? Well, you have these under the Islamic framework, and this would get into a discussion related to the fitrah, or what we may call spiritual intuition. Under the modern worldview, while you do have first principles, but again, you find that those first principles are just accepted. So axiomatic truths, first principles, basic beliefs. Perhaps there's an idea of intuition, but again, it's kind of a bit of a question mark. All right, so that's comparing epistemologies. And again, what you'll find, like we found under ontology, is that when it comes to the Islamic epistemology, you have an epistemic kind of liberation in a sense, where it's not just your epistemology is not limited to the natural world, but in fact you have an extension of that epistemology. You have kind of a broadening by way of access to revelation. Whereas in the modern worldview, your epistemology is limited to the natural world. So in a sense, you're in a type of epistemic cage, especially if one doesn't accept testimony as well. Now you've made the cage even smaller. So when you compare the Islamic worldview to the modern worldview, what you're going to find is that in one case you have, the Islamic worldview, which is very rich, which is very meaningful, which is very thick in a sense, and broad in the sense that there is an ability to know things in a way that's much more comprehensive and much more wide and broad, as opposed to the narrowness of the modern worldview, which limits one's epistemology to just the natural world. Let's move on now to anthropology. And again, we're not talking about the field of anthropology, but we're talking about the human being. And we're talking here questions about what is man? What is the constitution of man? And again, let's compare the Islamic worldview to the modern worldview. The Islamic worldview states that there's indeed a body, a physical body. Modern worldview also holds that there's a physical body. The Islamic worldview, when it comes to mind, and here we would say mind/heart, we talk about concepts like aql, qalb, fu'ad, lub, all of these concepts that have to do with the idea of a mind, but that idea is a bit more pronounced. Whereas when you look at within the modern worldview, where you have the idea of a mind, and that's it. What about a soul or a ruh, as is known in the Islamic worldview? Well, of course, you have that, as Allah says in the Quran, يَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الرُّوحِ قُلِ الرُّوحُ مِنْ أَمْرِ رَبِّي. So they ask you concerning the ruh, concerning the soul, say it is from the command of my Lord, right? So there's clearly a soul, there's a spiritual reality, a spirituality or a spirit within the human being. Within the modern worldview, it's a question mark. Is there a soul? Is there not a soul? Don't know. Under the Islamic worldview, when we think about the constitution of a human being or an attribute of the human being, one that's conceptually central is language. And the fact that the human being can articulate themselves, the fact that they can use language, the fact that language is something that's very specific to the human being. And in the sense that its communicative ability, where a human being can take a limited data set or limited kind of input and have unlimited or almost infinite output. So for instance, when it comes to the concept of language, I can take a certain limited number of words, put them together, and come out with unlimited concepts. So for example, if I'll present a sentence. I went to the moon yesterday. I had some McDonald's. I went to the McDonald's drive-thru on the moon. I ordered a Big Mac. The Big Mac itself, the buns were green, and the meat was very juicy. When I bit into it, it tasted great, and then I drove away from the McDonald's and decided to go for dessert at the local cheesecake factory on the moon. Now when I got there, the time for prayer had come in, and so therefore I decided that I would use the restroom, make ablution, and pray the prayer. I am pretty sure you have never heard that sentence because I've never spoken that sentence. So what we see is that human language is something quite phenomenal, and it's quite central within the Islamic worldview. The Quran states very clearly, Allah states in the Quran, عَلَّمَهُ الْبَيَانِ, that He has taught you this speech, this ability to speak. Similarly, the idea of language when it comes to the creation of Adam, and one of the first things that he was taught was the names of things, the ability to assign a name to a concept or to a physical entity or whatever it might be. This is very conceptually central. It's central within the Islamic worldview. Is that the case with a modern worldview? And while it's there, it's studied, maybe studied under the philosophy of language, linguistics, and so on. It's not a central concept within the modern worldview. Let's look at one other point related to anthropology, and that is the idea of moral accountability. And so under the Islamic worldview, you find one being held morally accountable. And this concept in the Islamic worldview, or rather in the Arabic language, is a person that is mukallif. They have taklif, they have moral responsibility, moral accountability. Now, you have the same idea within the modern worldview. However, you have moral responsibility, but it is incidental. Whereas when you look at the Islamic worldview, this moral responsibility, this idea of the human being mukallif, is intertwined with one's very purpose. And this idea of a moral accountability is intertwined with one's teleology, one's purpose. And we said from the section on ontology that that is something that exists, is real, it is under the Muslim worldview. When it comes to the modern worldview, we see that under the modern worldview, there is moral accountability, but it is incidental. So once again, what we see is when we compare these worldviews, and we could keep on going, but I think we're, in terms of components, this is sufficient. We can see that under the Islamic worldview, it is very rich. It is infused with meaning and depth and content. Whereas when you compare that to the modern worldview, you see that it is quite empty. There's some content, and there's some there's some content. There's some areas within ontology, epistemology, and so on and so forth that it does have a content. But by and large, the content, when compared to the Islamic worldview, is quite shallow, or it's quite light. It's quite, you can say, emaciated. So with that said, now that we have kind of done a comparison of worldviews, and this can be done with other worldviews as well, you compare Islam to Christianity, Islam to Buddhism, Islam to postmodernism, whatever it might be, critical theory, whatever it might be, and you can come up with this kind of comparison, to compare and contrast. Now, there is the idea within the worldview, what we find, the idea of what we call assumptions, or rather axioms and axiomatic truths. Now, I briefly mentioned this when we were comparing worldviews, and I wanted to read out an entry under worldview by Daniel Hill and Randall Rouser. And they have, under this entry under worldview, there's a statement here which reads, "One can think of a worldview as comprising of a number of basic beliefs," or here you can read axioms, axiomatic truths, "a number of basic beliefs which are philosophically equivalent to the axioms of the worldview considered as a logical or consistent theory. These basic beliefs cannot, by definition, be proven." So just to, highlight some of the points in here, when we're talking about basic beliefs or axioms, these are, you can say, self-evident truths. These are truths that you accept, but you cannot prove. And every system, every worldview has axioms. So what's being said here, and I'll just repeat it, one can think of a worldview as comprising a number of basic beliefs which are philosophically equivalent to the axioms of the worldview considered as a logical and consistent theory. These basic beliefs cannot, by definition, be proven in the logical sense within the worldview, precisely because they are axioms and are typically argued from rather than argued for. So when it comes to any single worldview, the point is that there are certain assumptions or certain axioms, certain basic beliefs that you start with and then you argue from rather than argue for. In the sense that you're not arguing to prove them because, again, a self-evident truth is self-evident by definition. So they are typically argued from rather than argued for. However, their coherence can be explored philosophically and logically. Now, why I'm mentioning this, the reason why I mention this is because when we think about worldviews and we understand that there are axioms, basic beliefs, etc., that they're based upon, we want to now ask the question, what are the axioms, what are the basic beliefs, what are the first principles that the Islamic view is based upon? And we're going to explore that in the next Sapient Thought video that follows this one. So until then, this is Fahad Taslim, and these are Sapient Thoughts.